Welcome to Thrifty History, a series of short documentaries covering the lesser known and often forgotten battles, campaigns and events throughout history. The subject of this inaugural episode is usually lost in the maelstrom of the Second World War. Interesting, as it should be considered a forgotten civil war, and contains possibly the only case of naval suicide. I present to you, dear viewers, the Battle of Gabon. There have been many wars, campaigns and battles fought throughout history. Many have become famous, their tales retold over and over again across all forms of media. But many more are forgotten, footnotes to another, or just simply lost to the chaos of time. It's here, from down the back of history's sofa, I bring you those neglected stories. Welcome to Thrifty History. Imagine you're the leader of one of the several French colonial territories in Africa. It's June 1940. You have just been informed that France has surrendered to the Germans. A week later, Charles DeGaulle broadcasts a rallying cry to the colonies to join him in continuing the fight and rejecting the Vichy collaborative government. What do? Do you continue to serve the new regime, knowing it's practically a puppet of another? Or do you risk throwing your lot in with someone who could just be a hyped-up revolutionary and start a rebellion against your masters? This was the choice that the governors of French Equatorial Africa had to make, one which took time and careful consideration for them to answer. Initially, there was strong interest in joining with DeGaulle, but the British actions at Mers el-Kebir damaged those prospects. It would be over 2 months later, on the 26th of August, that Governor Felix Eboué, the Chad in charge of Chad, a character that I hope to do an independent video on one day, and Colonel Machard announced Chad's support for the Free French cause. This started a landslide, with the Cameroonian Gaullists appointing the recently arrived chef d'escadron, Philippe de Hautecluc, another Chad who, to protect his family back in France from the potential repercussions of his name ever appearing in the newspaper, went by the nom de guerre, or war name, of the Clerk. Yeah, that doesn't sound as sexy translated into English. Let's stick to the French. Leclerc. As the governor of Cameroon the next day, over the next few days, French Congo would follow suit, with Colonel Edgar Delamina ousting General Husson. Ubangi Cheri would declare its support soon after. Around the same time, on the evening of the 28th, Georges Pierre Masson pledged Gabon's support. With this, the entirety of French Equatorial Africa had declared itself for DeGaulle. And then, like usual, it was ruined by the church. The Bishop of Libreville, one Louis-Michel François Tardy, was openly supportive of the Vichy government, especially their anti-Freemasonry policies. As many of the French population within Libreville were part of his congregation, he was quite influential. Along with a submarine commander, who I'll talk more about later, and an angry crowd, the bishop persuaded Masson to go back on his decision. Those sympathetic to the Gaullist cause would quickly be imprisoned and deported to Dakar. Thus ended the so-called 3 glorious days, and by the start of September the situation was as such. De Gaulle had acquired a substantial amount of land, but with Gabon's refusal he had a major problem, and those who opposed him had came to the same conclusion. Even with all the other territories, the Free French cause would be in a highly vulnerable situation, with such a large enemy position right at its centre. It wasn't something he could just ignore. Its location and large coastline could facilitate the resupplying of enemy vessels, or the staging ground of raids on the Free French shipping and logistics. In Charles' own words, a hostile enclave that was hard to reduce because it gave onto the ocean was created in the heart of our equatorial holdings. The Free French saw no other option. They would have to take it by force. These facts weren't lost on the Gabonese either. As early as the 27th, the authorities had ordered the reinforcement of its border with Cameroon. Now, invasion plans take time to prepare, so an actual invasion would not begin for another 2 months. However, on the 3rd of September, Roger Godet was allowed to cross the border from Cameroon after gaining special permission due to medical necessities, acting as a courier for some specific medicine. Godet's actual reason was to meet the commander of the Bitam garrison, one Captain Gervais. He tried to get the captain and his forces to swap sides, but Gervais, despite his Gaullist sympathies, would only agree if his superior in Oyem, the chief administrator in Oyem, called Besson, also supported DeGaulle, but had no desire to turn against his own superiors. After a few days, Roger came up with a solution. On the 5th, he informed Besson that he was relieving him of command. Besson offered no resistance, and on the 6th left for Cameroon. Gaudet would hand over command to Pierre-Roger Matek, who would later arrive with friendly forces. Far to the south, along the coast, is the post of Mayumba and its airfield. The Gabonese command decided to send a small force to defend it. This force was made up of the Marines from the Viso Bougainville and a group of native troops from Port Gentil, an estimated 50 men. They were landed on the beach from the transport ship Cap de Palmes, having been escorted by the submarine Poncelet. Once ashore, led by the submarine's commander, Bertrand de Saussine, the group was instructed to shoot at any aircraft that flew by. However, unknown to them, the Gaullists had already started landing there since the 9th. They were flown in from Port Noir by Potters 540 that had to do 2 trips due to its limited capacity. The second trip brought in Commander André Parent, with a few other officers. This also happened to land on the 15th, but this went unnoticed by the arriving Vichy troops, because of the forest and the hills between where they had docked and the airfield itself. The 3 French grouped up at the airfield, only a dozen of them in all, before heading off towards the post. Along the way, they encountered some of the native militia, who, upon seeing Parent's officer stripes, formed up and presented arms. The commander, on his part, keeps calm and orders them to follow him. Now I know what you're thinking. I'll go into it later, but this does happen a lot. They all arrive in the parade square out front of the administration hut. The natives line up and present arms, and with his holster open but his weapon still in it, Parent makes his surprise entry. Now he is flanked by a pair of soldiers with bayoneted rifles, and there is a machine gun set up out front just in case things got a bit impoliter. And I say, as he had walked in on the sub-commander and the head admin of the district, whilst they were dining. In front of his audience, he proclaimed 3 things. Firstly, that they had the building surrounded, and the post was held by his men. This was true. There were men covering every side of the hut. The last bit, not so much. Second, that he had 3 planes at his disposal nearby. A bit of an exaggeration. He had 1, and it was a transport. It did have 3 engines, though. Finally, that his battalion is in the forest near the lagoon, and that boats of reinforcements were on their way. This was complete bollocks. Commander Bertrand apparently responds to this with, "That's good, we're leaving," and they were given 4 hours for everyone who wanted to return with them to Libreville to get packed up and go. The fact that they said they would leave and were allowed to do so does make me think that they knew Parent was bluffing and didn't have enough troops to detain them all. The fact they still left tells me that they didn't know by how much. Apparently, many of the Marines chose to stay. DeGaulle had arrived in Douala, the now capital of Cameroon, on the 8th of October. He quickly authorised the invasion plans before moving off to Chad and started planning for what would come next. 19 days later, on the 27th, the invasion began, with 3 French troops crossing the borders. That same day, in the north, a bloodless skirmish that had been going on since Gaudet had taken control of Oyem had ended with the capture of Mitzik. At the same time, a column of Gaullists advanced north, from the French Congo, along what is now the N1 highway. Each settlement along the way would quickly capitulate to them, until they encountered some resistance from Lambaréné. By the 5th, it too surrendered. Both it and Mitzik's garrisons would capitulate after the European citizens and officers had fled, scared off by 3 French air attack. This 2-pronged attack was supposed to meet up at Libreville, but the dense jungle and poor roads hindered their progression. Leclerc, realising that he was going to fall behind his expected time frame, initiated his backup plan. On the 7th, a convoy of 3 ships left Dondoula and headed south. At its lead was the Aviso, Savignon de Brazza, under the command of Georges Thierry d'Alneux, the minesweeper Commandant Domine, and the cargo ship Casamance. On board this vessel was the 13th Demi-Brigade of the Foreign Legion, under the command of Battalion Chief Koenig, alongside trilageurs from Cameroon. Their destination was Libreville. This force hadn't gone unnoticed though, and the redoubtable class submarine Poncelet, now residing in Port Gentil, was ordered to intercept. Even with a portion of its crew left ashore to bolster the garrison, Commander Bertrand de Sassine followed his orders and steamed northwards. However, the Royal Navy was also supporting the landings and had been keeping tabs on the sub. Just before 4 in the afternoon, Poncelet spots HMS Milford, who was out on anti-submarine patrol. Unfortunately, soon after, it is spotted in return, with the sloop of war giving chase. With the Vichy sub running on the surface, though, the Milford was barely able to keep up. Not wanting the sub to escape, the task force leader, Admiral Cunningham, dispatched a supermarine walrus from his ship, the HMS Devonshire. The walrus would drop its 2 100-pound depth charges either side of Poncelet, forcing it to dive. In retaliation, the sub launches a torpedo at Milford. Depending on the source, this either passes right under the ship or hits it but fails to explode. They then try to launch a second one, but this jams in the tube and fills the sub with smoke and water. By this point, Milford was close enough to depth charge them, forcing the sub to surface before opening up with its guns. Poncelet would dive again, but the damage it had already sustained was too much. Coupled with the possibility of choking to death with all the smoke filling the sub from the failed torpedo, Commander Bertrand chose to surface and gave the order to abandon ship. He got his men into the life rafts, and once he was sure they were safe, Bertrand de Sassine went below and opened the seacocks. At 18:20, HMS Milford would report the scuttling of the submarine, before picking up its surviving crew. Of the 55 crewmen of the Poncelet, 54 would be captured. The only casualty was Commander Bertrand de Sassine, who went down with his ship. In France, he would be regarded as a national naval hero, a sentiment that was shared not just by the Vichy, but also within the Free French. On the night of the 8th, Koenig landed his forces in the mangroves north of Libreville. Strangely, I couldn't find that much detail on the battle for the city itself. From what I did find, it said that the fighting began almost immediately and was hard. It wouldn't be until the next morning, assisted from the air by Westland Lysanders and from the sea by the guns of the Savillon de Brazza, that the legionaries and colonial troops could push their way into the city, capturing the airfield and engaging in street-to-street fighting. Back in the mouth of the Gabon estuary, a rare event was about to take place. The lead ship of her class, Bougainville, opened fire on her sister. The Savillon de Brazza turned its guns from the shore bombardment and returned fire. For around 20 minutes, the sisters exchanged fire. Despite the advantage of the first strike, the fact that a portion of her crew had been brought ashore and deployed far to the south reduced Bougainville's rate of fire. This was enough of an advantage for the Savillon de Brazza to take the fight, leaving her opponent ablaze and then sinking shortly after. I was unable to find an exact number of survivors, but apparently the loss of life was high. Libreville would surrender by the end of the day. Only one final holdout remained for the Vichy forces, Port Gentil, and it too fell the same day, for around a few minutes. From what I could gather from either a poorly written or more likely badly translated extract, a pair of 3 French officers, Lieutenant Ezano and Second Lieutenant Sandre, with the help of a local hotel owner, would blag their way into the town and swap the standard French flag flying there for one with the Cross of Lorraine on. Barely a moment later, a staff car full of angry Vichy officers arrived and told them to remove it immediately. This they did, but only once the new arrivals had reluctantly agreed to them doing it by the proper ceremony. After all, it was still a flag of France. At this point, they would have been captured. However, they were, also with some reluctance, let go. Reason being that, apparently, if the pair weren't back within an hour, the Gaullists would bomb the place. I don't know if this was a bluff or not, but upon Rizano's return to Libreville, he is said to have had a bollocking off Leclerc. In the end, Port Gentil would surrender on the 12th, without firing a shot. I've seen some sources claim that there was only a single casualty in its taking. However, this is a misinterpretation of the facts. For this same day, Governor Masson would, and I say this to comply with YouTube guidelines, end his existence. I can only assume that some authors have put the two together, given the few resources on this topic, but Masson had never left Libreville. In an extract I found, that I will talk more about later, it states that he had a stormy interview with DeGaulle sometime early that day. Personally, from what I know from my research, I kind of feel sorry for him. He was all for continuing the fight after the armistice, and when his neighbours announced their support for DeGaulle, he wanted to follow suit. It was his people he governed that didn't. It was the pressure of the bishop and of Commander de Sassine, who met with him alongside other local leaders that night. Without any evidence to suggest otherwise, I can only assume that in order for him to remain in power and not be ousted by this group, he gave up on his convictions.
Now some of you may still be thinking, was this all necessary? And what good did it do? And I would say, yes. And a lot for them. The rallying of French Equatorial Africa was very important to DeGaulle's fledgling cause. It gave them a base to work from, a place to recruit from, and an economy to help finance them. Most importantly, it gave them legitimacy, as before this they were just a government in exile. And as I mentioned at the start, they had to take Gabon, so there wasn't a hostile stronghold within their midst. Of course, this came with its costs. We know that 4 aircraft were lost, along with 6 crewmen. Unfortunately, it's difficult to ascertain the true number of casualties due to conflicting sources. DeGaulle is said to have claimed some 20 have died throughout the whole thing. However, I was unable to find the exact question he was asked for him to give this answer, and expect he may have only been referring to friendly European losses. I say European, as another source claims that Vichy losses were 35 to only 8 Free French. Other numbers put forward are dozens, 33, and roughly 100. I take these with a pinch of salt though, as like DeGaulle's aforementioned claim, I was unable to find what they were made in exact reference to. This is mostly down to A. It usually comes from a rare book I can't afford. 2. The book is written in a language I can't read. In fact, I expect the last claim may be a combination of the casualties from both sides. As for those Vichy troops that survived, they were arrested. De Gaulle made a personal appearance before them in an attempt to persuade them to join him. Unfortunately, few did, and the rest were sent to be interned in Brazzaville as POWs. This included their general, Marcel Tatu. Other Vichy sympathisers had the same fate. This would include the Bishop of Libreville, Louis Tadi. Remember him? Leclerc had him arrested after he refused to perform a mass to celebrate the victory. Fortunately for Philippe, Captain DeGaulle also happened to be an ordained priest and stepped in to fulfill the task. There is a slightly darker side to all of this. Those prisoners would be used as hostages to deter the Vichy government back home from targeting the families of those who sided against them. Now I said earlier we'll talk about what happened at Mayumba with the local troops, because diving into this topic brought to light something that is rarely touched on in these colonial conflicts. To talk about this part of the world and not cover how the natives viewed this whole affair would be an injustice. It's their home after all. As much as I'm going to focus on the Gabonese here, a lot of this also applies to other native groups of French Equatorial Africa and Cameroon. Now it was said in 1946 that the population of AEF unanimously sided with de Gaulle, being drawn in by his honour and grandeur. This is propaganda, of course. It was spoken by a close ally of Felix Aboué after all. But it does highlight the post-war projection of a united Gaullist African front against the Vichy German oppressors. The reality is way more complicated. Sure, some did side with de Gaulle, but there were some groups that were pro-Vichy. First, the natives of Gabon aren't one people, but lots of smaller ethnic groups. Several of these from around Libreville were highly Catholic, and in turn heavily influenced by the local church leaders like Tadi, so they strongly favoured Pétain. However, both of these cases are outliers for the most part. As for the majority of the Gabonese, frankly, they were ambivalent. As one Cameroonian writer put it as, a war between white tribes. These people had little to no political power, and just saw this as a changing of the guard. The native troops, known as Senegalese trillicheurs, despite the obvious fact that not all of them were from Senegal, would be trained to follow the orders of their white officers without question, a majority of them being forcefully conscripted in the first place. This left little sympathy for either side. Now sure, they may not be wise to the global politics of the world, but don't think that means they were dumb either. Mayumba is a good example. The sergeant leading that group towards the airfield had orders to stop the enemy from landing there. But how do you tell who is an enemy? If they're attacking you, that's an enemy. Wearing a different uniform? That could be an enemy. Casually walking towards you in the uniform of a friendly officer? Probably not an enemy. Initially, that squad made ready to fire on the Free French group, but the sergeant had ordered them to present arms when he realised it was an officer. Before anyone says anything about a band or a patch being worn to show allegiance, this was the early days of the Free French. It also assumes these identification markers were known to the Vichy forces, and that the trillicheurs would be informed of it. Why yes, he could have asked Parent whose side he was on, but remember, they were trained to follow an officer without question. To do so would not be a smart career move for that sergeant, so he just followed orders. For many of these conscripts, it was just self-preservation. There are a pair of cases from the settlement of Boué, where two individuals chose to follow the orders of ousted Vichy officers. In doing so, they followed their own agendas, and would eventually return to Boué once they realised it wasn't worth the effort, and that the Gaullists were looking for them. I'm oversimplifying these stories, for the sake of time, but they're an amazing insight into the lives of these people. After the Europeans abandoned Mitzik and Lambré, the Gabonese locals would take the opportunity to loot whatever was left behind. The long and short of it is that the indigenous peoples of Gabon didn't care who won, and usually chose to stay out of it. For those that couldn't avoid involvement, their decisions were based on self-preservation and personal gain. There is a silver lining for them though. With the Gaullist victory came a shake-up. Having limited forces to carry out all the required duties, the Free French would come to rely more and more on the trillicheurs. Before the conflict, it was normal to see boats of imprisoned natives going down the river with white troops guarding them. Now, they were seeing the opposite, local blacks guarding Vichy prisoners. There were other signs too, but the balance of power had shifted. Even before the capture of Gabon, DeGaulle was already preparing the next phase of the war. He was in Chad, making plans and improving the logistical infrastructure. From his newly stabilised base, he was going to launch an attack against the Axis forces. The only border this territory had with any of them, though, was far to the north, against Libya, through the desert. That's a future topic, though. I hope you join me there. Like this video if you found it interesting, subscribe if you want to see more, and if you're willing to, please leave a comment. I'm still a rookie at this, so any constructive feedback is appreciated. Thank you for watching, and enjoy the rest of your day.